In the quiet outskirts of Los Angeles, California, 60-year-old Walter Calloway inhabited a spacious, 4-bedroom suburban house that breathed entirely with the ghost of his beloved late wife, Margaret. Every physical corner of that sanctuary carried her indelible spirit, from the pale yellow shutters she had stubbornly argued over for 3 solid weeks to the vibrant raised garden beds she had built with her own raw hands on Saturday mornings. Following her passing 4 years prior, Walter had maintained everything precisely as she left it, finding a bittersweet solace in the familiar scent of the rose bushes lining the front fence. His days settled into a predictable, deeply comforting rhythm, anchored entirely by quiet mornings on the back porch and a cherished Sunday tradition with his next-door neighbor, Dave. Dave would quietly walk up to the back gate, carrying 2 fresh cups of diner coffee, handing one through the wooden slats with the unspoken understanding of a man who recognized profound grief without needing unnecessary words. This serene garden oasis was Walter's absolute refuge from the chaotic world, representing the only remaining tangible bridge connecting his past devotion to his present solitude. A fragile yet sacred peace that he guarded with a gentle, enduring reverence while navigating the quiet twilight of his retired life every single day. Then came a sudden, disruptive Thursday evening in October of 2022, shattering the tranquil autumn air, when my son Mason knocked heavily on the front door. Standing right beside him on the sidewalk was his wife, Brianna, accompanied by a rented moving truck idling loudly at the curb, its exhaust polluting the gentle evening breeze. Mason, 33 years old and working in mid-level logistics management in downtown Los Angeles, possessed my jawline but carried his mother's hauntingly familiar eyes. Beside him, 30-year-old Brianna stood with sharp, restless features, perpetually preoccupied with her smartphone and running 3 separate social media accounts dedicated to her lifestyle brand. Before they had even unpacked a single plate or towel box, their chaotic arrival was already signaled by 2 bulky ring lights and a professional camera tripod hoisted awkwardly onto the front porch. When I opened the wooden door and took in the massive rental vehicle blocking the driveway, my chest tightened with an instinctive, suffocating dread that forced me to press my palm against the doorframe for physical support. Mason's voice cracked with a fragile, boyhood vulnerability as he explained that their landlord had suddenly raised the rent, leaving them unable to afford the increase while saving for a down payment. They desperately needed 6 months, just 6 short months, to stabilize their shaky finances before moving out into a home of their own. My throat burned instantly with a sharp, dry ache, and every single defensive instinct I had meticulously cultivated across 35 years of reading human behavior in high school classrooms was fiercely screaming at me to refuse. As a retired history teacher who had spent decades observing which teenagers would honor their commitments and which ones would inevitably manufacture convenient excuses, my gut warned me that welcoming them in was a grave mistake. Yet, in that agonizing moment of hesitation, Mason's eyes grew suspiciously wet at the corners, mirroring Margaret's expression with such heartbreaking precision that my chest ached as though it were being slowly pulled apart at the seams. Beneath the sophisticated veneer of Brianna's ambitious lifestyle branding, I saw my son, the boy who used to fall asleep softly on my shoulder during long Sunday drives, standing before me in desperate need of paternal shelter. Overwhelmed by a powerful wave of sorrow and residual parental duty, I pushed past my internal warnings, swallowed my deep reservations, and reluctantly agreed to their 6-month timeline. Brianna immediately flashed a bright, practiced, and unnaturally polished smile, assuring me with rehearsed theatricality that they would be exceptionally respectful of my space, and that I would barely even notice their presence in the house. That final, glib promise should have served as my ultimate flashing warning sign, because people who genuinely intend to live respectfully under another person's roof never feel any urgent psychological need to announce it so defensively in advance. The initial 2 months of our strange domestic cohabitation proceeded smoothly enough, functioning as a fragile truce, where Mason actively assisted with heavy yard work on weekends, and Brianna cooked dinner twice, photographing both meals extensively before allowing anyone to touch their food. However, as the calendar inexorably flipped into month 3, the polite veneer rapidly dissolved, revealing a profound sense of entitlement that gradually poisoned the peaceful atmosphere of Margaret's home. Brianna began sleeping in leisurely until 10:30 or 11 in the morning, drifting languidly into the kitchen while I sat quietly reading the morning paper to pour herself fresh coffee from the pot I had already brewed. She would stand there scrolling through her phone, complaining loudly about sluggish internet speeds interrupting her content uploads, while unceremoniously consuming my provisions, utilizing my kitchen appliances, and enjoying absolute silence without ever offering a single token of gratitude. The quiet sanctity I had spent years cultivating in memory of my late wife was systematically trampled underfoot by a young woman who treated my entire household like a complimentary 5-star resort. Mason, caught miserably in the crossfire of his wife's escalating demands and his father's patient tolerance, slowly retreated into silence, allowing his marital obligations to override every vestige of familial respect and common decency. The house was no longer a shared sanctuary of healing memories. It had transformed into a staging ground for modern selfishness, where my boundaries were treated as mere inconveniences to be brushed aside by the relentless march of youthful self-absorption. One crisp Sunday morning, while I was outside meticulously deadheading Margaret's beloved yellow roses, my loyal neighbor Dave walked up to the fence line, leaning his forearms on the wooden slats with the heavy expression of a man choosing his words with extreme care. He watched the back door of the house for a long moment before fixing his knowing gaze upon me and asking point blank how much longer my son and daughter-in-law were planning on lingering under my roof. When I reminded him of the original 6-month agreement, Dave offered a slow, skeptical nod and picked up his coffee cup with the unmistakable demeanor of someone who entirely disbelieved every syllable of that timeline. I did not argue with him, because deep down in the hidden chambers of my heart, beneath the stubborn desire to believe in my only child, a cold, chilling intuition whispered that Dave was entirely correct. The promised 6 months had quietly bled into 7, and 7 was rapidly marching toward 9, while the bank accounts and retirement funds I had spent decades securing remained dangerously exposed to supplementary access. Standing there among the blossoming thorns of Margaret's garden, holding my pruning shears with fingers that suddenly felt strangely cold, I realized that my boundless hospitality was no longer acting as a loving parental rescue, but rather as an open invitation for my peace to be systematically plundered. The fragile boundaries between genuine kindness and blind enabling had finally worn paper thin, leaving me standing on the precipice of an inevitable financial and emotional reckoning that would soon shatter the remaining illusions of my golden years. The inevitable emotional and financial collision arrived on a sharp, frost-kissed autumn morning when I walked into the kitchen to review my monthly finances, only to experience a sudden, paralyzing drop in my chest. Staring down at the printed bank statement resting flat against the polished wood of Margaret's table, my eyes locked onto a staggering, unauthorized electronic wire transfer that had systematically hollowed out the core of my retirement savings. It was not a routine household grocery expense or a minor utility adjustment, but rather a massive, calculated depletion of the secure financial foundation I had spent decades quietly accumulating to ensure I would never become a burden to anyone in my twilight years. The sophisticated online transaction had bypassed my primary oversight because of a supplementary access link I had foolishly trusted my son with months prior, operating with the cold precision of an invisible burglary committed right beneath my own roof. For several long, agonizing minutes, my hands trembled uncontrollably against the paper, while the crisp morning light poured through the pale yellow kitchen curtains, illuminating a stark and chilling reality that words could scarcely capture. I was no longer merely a generous, accommodating father sharing his retirement space with struggling children. I was a victim of deliberate financial betrayal, orchestrated by the very flesh and blood I had spent a lifetime nurturing, protecting, and supporting through every single difficult storm in this life. Just a few agonizing days after that devastating financial discovery paralyzed my spirit, the physical manifestation of my stolen life savings pulled smoothly into our residential driveway with a deep, expensive engine purr that felt like a deliberate insult to my intelligence. I was standing out near the garden beds, trying to steady my racing thoughts, when a brand new, jet black luxury SUV, glistening with aggressive chrome trim and smelling intensely of fresh factory leather, brought a jarring, arrogant presence to our quiet neighborhood. Mason stepped out from the driver's side with an awkward, puffed-up posture and an uncharacteristic chin lift that I instantly recognized as the defensive mask of a guilty conscience. Before my feet could even carry me toward them, Brianna burst through the front door with breathless velocity, letting out a piercing shriek of manufactured ecstasy that startled the local birds clear out of the fence line. She threw her arms around Mason's neck, laughing and spinning in a cinematic celebration that belonged on a commercial screen rather than a modest suburban lawn. When I walked over and quietly asked about the exorbitant cost of the $80,000 vehicle, Mason offered a flickering, nervous grin and claimed it was a massive corporate performance bonus. Yet his eyes desperately avoided my gaze, while his trembling hands completely betrayed the manufactured lie they had prepared. Driven by an aching, compulsive need to align the shattered pieces of reality, I waited until the house had fallen completely silent that evening before cross-referencing the exact date and timestamp of the bank statement withdrawal against a discarded vehicle financing brochure I found tucked beneath some magazines on the living room table. The numerical figures and tracking codes aligned with the undeniable mechanical precision of a signed confession, confirming beyond any lingering shadow of doubt that my lifetime retirement savings had served as the direct down payment for their arrogant display of status. A dull, persistent ache radiated upward from my chest into my jaw. The familiar physiological signature of deep, untreated grief finding itself trapped in a dead end with nowhere else to escape. Every natural impulse in my nervous system urged me to storm upstairs, pound on their bedroom door, and unleash a righteous fury born from decades of sacrifice. But a deeper, harder wisdom quickly took command of my breath. 35 years of standing before high school classrooms had taught me that roaring in anger only hands your opponent the emotional upper hand, whereas absolute, freezing silence strips away their psychological defenses. I pressed the heels of my palms hard against the wooden desktop, breathing through the raw pain until it transformed into something much colder, sharper, and far more deliberate. A quiet, unshakable resolve to fight back with strategy rather than emotion. Every single day. Knowing instinctively that emotional outbursts would achieve nothing against modern entitlement, I picked up my landline phone and quietly dialed Phil Hartman, my trusted attorney of 11 years who specialized in California real estate and property rights law. Phil was never a man given to warm pleasantries or comforting reassurances. His mind operated with the sharp, clinical efficiency of a machine designed exclusively to navigate the complicated labyrinth of state legal codes. When I outlined the grim details of unauthorized residency, financial exploitation, and broken domestic trust, Phil listened with an unflinching professionalism before guiding me precisely through the unyielding parameters of California civil law. He informed me that because my son and daughter-in-law had resided in the house for well over 12 consecutive months without a formal lease agreement, standard informal removal was legally impossible under California Civil Code 1946.1. Instead, the law mandated a strict, formal 60-day written notice served directly through certified mail with signature confirmation before any administrative or judicial eviction proceedings could ever be initiated. Phil made it explicitly clear that skipping a single technical requirement would completely invalidate my standing, turning my own home into a legal nightmare where the trespassers held all the cards unless every single procedural chess piece was moved with absolute flawless precision to protect my sovereign property rights. As the legal gears began turning quietly behind the scenes, I made the conscious, disciplined choice to lock my emotions behind an impenetrable wall of ordinary daily routines, letting them believe their manipulation was working better than ever. Phil drafted the formal 60-day notice on official legal letterhead, ensuring it was dispatched with certified signature tracking, while I sat silently at my kitchen table, calculating the unfolding calendar with military precision. I mapped out the exact expiration date of the legal notice, discovering with a chilling, poetic sense of symmetry that the final mandatory deadline for their lawful departure fell precisely on December 2nd, placing the entire climax right on the heels of the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. I watched Mason and Brianna go about their daily lives with blissful ignorance, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was dissolving into sand, while they planned extravagant holiday menus using money that did not belong to them. By choosing not to expose their crimes prematurely, I allowed their unchecked arrogance to spin an ever tighter web of self-deception, ensuring that when the legal clock finally ran out, their manufactured world would collapse entirely under its own unbearable weight. The countdown had officially begun, and for the first time since they crossed my threshold, I felt a cool, steady power returning to my hands as I waited for the trap to spring shut on their illusions. By the third week of November, the toxic atmosphere inside Margaret's house escalated into a full-scale psychological assault when Brianna cheerfully announced her grand plans for an upcoming Thanksgiving celebration that would forever shatter my remaining patience. Without a single ounce of consultation or basic courtesy, she informed us that she had invited a staggering 40 extended family members to descend upon our residence for a massive holiday feast. Then, with a chilling lack of self-awareness, she looked straight at me and demanded that I surrender my master bedroom suite to her parents, Richard and Carol, because older people deserved premium comfort. To top off her outrageous demands, she casually suggested that I pack up my belongings and sleep out in the damp, uninsulated garage for the few days they would be visiting. Standing in the living room, while her words hung heavily in the air, I realized with a sharp, stinging clarity that my own home had been entirely stolen from beneath my feet. I was no longer treated as the rightful owner or even a respected elder under my own roof, but rather as an inconvenient tenant expected to hide away in the shadows so that strangers could perform their hollow domestic theater of perceived wealth and superficial status every single day. The sheer audacity of her entitlement reached a sickening peak just 4 days before the holiday when Brianna swept into the kitchen wearing an expensive silk robe, holding her smartphone in one hand while carelessly tossing 2 sheets of thick cardstock onto the wooden table right in front of my face. Without offering a polite greeting or checking to see if I was busy, she commanded me to complete every single item on her extensive shopping list by the following afternoon, without fail. Her tone was that of a demanding hotel concierge addressing a hired servant, completely unapologetic, as she explained she had a morning hair appointment, a nail session scheduled right after, and essential lifestyle content to shoot before dinner. The shopping list itself was a grotesque catalog of financial excess, featuring 2 massive organic turkeys from an exclusive butcher Imported French cheeses, artisanal charcuterie boards, cases of imported sparkling water, and specialty vintage wines that required advance orders. As I stared down at the unreasonable demands scrawled across the paper, a slow, heavy pulse throbbed behind my temples. My heart hammered with a deep, aching grief, not merely from anger, but from the heartbreaking realization of how profoundly my son's life had been hijacked by a woman whose selfishness knew absolutely no boundaries whatsoever. Caught in the eye of this escalating domestic storm stood my son Mason, a tragic shadow of the boy I had raised, watching silently from the doorway, while his wife treated his aging father like an unpaid domestic employee. When Brianna sharply summoned him into the kitchen to back up her outrageous commands, Mason appeared with the hollow, haunted eyes of a man who had long ago surrendered his moral compass to preserve a fragile, dysfunctional peace. His shoulders were already caved inward in defeat, and his jaw worked nervously as he struggled to find words that could somehow appease us both without offending his wife's tyrannical rule. Instead of defending me or reclaiming his own dignity, he looked down at the kitchen tile and muttered a weak, pathetic plea for me to just give in, calling it just groceries, and insisting that Thanksgiving required mutual sacrifice. Watching him cower in fear while abandoning every principle of respect I had spent a lifetime teaching him, I felt a profound wave of sorrow wash over my soul. He had willingly allowed himself to become entirely consumed by Brianna's toxic narcissism, trading his independence for a counterfeit illusion of marital harmony, leaving me standing alone to face an impossible betrayal delivered by the very child of my own flesh and blood. Instead of exploding into the raging confrontation they were silently provoking, I pushed back my wooden chair with deliberate slowness, stood up with absolute composure, and delivered my very first quiet, decisive blow against their reign of exploitation. I looked straight past Brianna's stunned expression, walked over to the landline phone resting quietly on the counter, and immediately dialed my bank's fraud and account security department. With a steady, unwavering voice, I requested the immediate and permanent deactivation of the supplementary credit card link I had foolishly extended to Mason 18 months prior. The very plastic that Brianna had been casually abusing for designer shopping sprees, high-end spa days, and lavish personal luxuries. As the automated voice confirmed that the supplementary card was now permanently dead and unusable, a sudden, weightless peace settled deep within my chest. I knew precisely what this action would trigger. It would cut off the financial oxygen feeding their arrogant lifestyle, right on the eve of their grand holiday performance. By systematically closing off their unauthorized access to my hard-earned resources, I was no longer merely enduring their disrespect. I was drawing a hard, uncrossable boundary that would soon force them to confront the stark, unfiltered reality of their own financial dependency and utter lack of genuine preparation for the real world. Completely oblivious to the financial landmine ticking beneath her feet, Brianna woke up the following morning wrapped in an artificial bubble of supreme, unshakable confidence, utterly convinced that my refusal the previous evening was nothing more than an empty, dramatic gesture from a stubborn old man. She moved through the house with swift, purposeful footsteps and bright, theatrical cheerfulness, absolutely certain that the easiest solution to her grocery crisis was to simply drive down to the local Whole Foods store, whip out the supplementary card, and buy everything on her extravagant list to prove she did not need my cooperation to succeed. I watched quietly from the garden as she stepped out the front door, doused in expensive perfume, car keys swinging effortlessly from 2 fingers, while oversized sunglasses hid her arrogant eyes. She announced loudly, to no one in particular, that she would handle everything herself, since asking for basic help around the house was apparently too difficult, before speeding away into the morning traffic. She drove off toward the bustling supermarket with her head held high, blissfully unaware that the financial safety net she had taken for granted had already vanished into thin air. She was marching straight into a carefully constructed trap, where the cold, merciless screen of a cash register would soon deliver a humiliating awakening that no amount of social media filtering or lifestyle branding could ever possibly hide from the rest of the world. The chaotic energy of Whole Foods on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving mirrored a controlled emergency, filled with frantic shoppers clutching long lists and crowding the aisles. Brianna moved through the crowded store with the intense, unhesitating focus she usually reserved for her online content curation, stacking her cart high with imported triple cream brie, gourmet charcuterie, and specialty vintage wines. She approached the checkout counter with absolute assurance, sliding the supplementary card into the payment terminal with the practiced grace of someone who had never experienced a single financial denial in her life. The cashier scanned the items, announced the staggering total, and waited while the terminal processed the transaction for 2 endless seconds before emitting a single, flat, merciless beep of rejection. Frowning slightly, Brianna instructed him to run it again, only to receive the exact same chilling response, declaring the card declined. Panic flared in her chest as she dialed Mason. But before he could answer, a woman standing directly behind her gasped with starstruck recognition and loudly proclaimed her love for Brianna's lifestyle channel. The humiliation struck like a physical blow, draining every drop of color from Brianna's face as she stood trapped under the public gaze. Completely stripped of her social media armor and drowning in an overwhelming wave of public mortification, Brianna was forced to abandon nearly all her overflowing carts, retaining only 4 meager bags of groceries she could barely afford on her own. She sped back to the suburban house with red-rimmed eyes and a jaw set in a rigid, furious tension, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the kitchen cabinets. Bursting into the living room where Mason stood looking helpless, she unleashed a torrent of blind fury, screaming about the card failure and demanding to know how her life had spiraled so catastrophically out of control in a single morning. When Mason admitted his financial helplessness, the fragile illusion shattered completely, leaving her standing amidst the wreckage of her own unsustainable deception. Retreating upstairs to the master bedroom, she slammed the door shut and collapsed onto the bed, surrendering to the bitter, unscripted tears of a person whose carefully manufactured world had finally imploded, without an audience left to applaud her performance. While the upstairs bedroom echoed with the muffled sounds of a modern lifestyle collapsing under its own weight, I remained entirely calm down below, executing a quiet departure I had meticulously planned the night before. At dawn, while the house slept in heavy, anxious silence, I lifted my pre-packed travel bag containing 3 days of clothes, my medications, and a small framed photograph of Margaret, stepping softly out toward the curb. A prearranged private car waited with its engine softly idling, its warm exhaust curling into the crisp morning air as I slid into the passenger seat without a single backward glance. I was heading north, toward the tranquil mountains of Ojai, to spend the holiday with my longtime friend Coach Bill, leaving behind a home devoid of food, preparation, or false security. As the vehicle pulled away and Margaret's yellow shutters faded in the side mirror, a profound, weightless peace filled my lungs, washing away years of quiet endurance. I was finally stepping out of a toxic dynamic and reclaiming my right to peace, leaving my son to face the unvarnished consequences of his choices. By early afternoon, the quiet suburban street erupted into a chaotic parade of rented sedans and overpacked SUVs, delivering 40 extended family members right to my front doorstep, exactly on schedule. Leading the grand procession was Brianna's father, Richard, a towering, self-important businessman wearing a formal sport coat on Thanksgiving Day, radiating the absolute confidence of a man accustomed to dominating every room he entered. He stepped out of his vehicle, surveyed the 4-bedroom house with an approving nod, and loudly announced to the gathered crowd that this was what a proper, successful family home truly looked like. Behind him floated Carol, his immaculate wife, already scanning the neglected rose bushes with a critical eye, while their relatives spilled eagerly onto the porch, chattering with high expectations of a lavish holiday feast. They carried the heavy air of entitled guests, ready to be pampered, completely oblivious to the absolute emptiness waiting for them inside. They walked toward the front entrance expecting an opulent celebration, hosted by a generous patriarch, walking blindly into a structural disaster crafted entirely by their own children's arrogance. The grand illusion began to unravel precisely 12 minutes after their arrival, when Mason nervously ushered the group out toward the garage for what was meant to be the triumphant unveiling of his $80,000 luxury SUV. With the showmanship of a desperate man, he pressed the key fob, unlocked the driver's side door, and invited everyone to crowd around and admire the gleaming chrome and factory leather. Well, everyone except Marilyn. Beaming with forced pride, he slid into the driver's seat and pressed the ignition button, expecting the powerful engine to roar to life and validate their entire existence. Instead, the dashboard flickered weakly before dying completely, leaving the vehicle entirely dead due to weeks of uninterrupted neglect and a depleted battery sitting silently in the dark. Mason pressed the button again and again with escalating panic, while 14 relatives stood in an awkward semicircle, their expressions shifting from eager anticipation to heavy confusion and quiet, mocking amusement. Uncle Ray loudly joked about his $4,000 Civic running circles around the luxury paperweight, turning Mason's supreme pride into a devastating public joke right before his eyes. Inside Margaret's home, the initial confusion swiftly deteriorated into mounting hostility as 40 hungry, exhausted relatives wandered through the spotless rooms, searching in vain for the promised holiday feast. The kitchen counters remained entirely bare, except for the 4 meager grocery bags Brianna had managed to salvage, devoid of turkeys, pies, or any semblance of a Thanksgiving meal. Whispers of discontent echoed down the hallway as elderly aunts and grumpy uncles complained openly about the bitter cold and rumbling stomachs, turning the festive gathering into an awkward hostage situation. Driven by acute panic and absolute desperation, Brianna retreated into the hallway, whipped out her phone, and dialed my number with trembling fingers, intending to unleash her fury. She did not bother with pleasantries or restraint, immediately launching into a shrill, abusive tirade that accused me of orchestrating a malicious sabotage to ruin her reputation. Her voice was sharp, unhinged, and dripping with venom as she demanded to know why I had abandoned them to this public humiliation, completely blind to the fact that her own unsustainable web of deceit had finally caught up with her on National Holiday Afternoon. Miles away, in the tranquil mountains of Ojai, I sat comfortably on the weathered wooden porch of Coach Bill's rustic cabin, holding a warm cup of coffee while watching the copper sunlight sweep across the hills. When my phone vibrated in my palm, I answered with deliberate slowness, listening to Brianna's furious shrieks echo wildly through the quiet mountain air before I finally spoke a single word. My voice remained remarkably steady, low, and perfectly unhurried, cutting through her frantic insults with the calm authority of a man who had finally reclaimed his peace of mind. I did not raise my voice or exchange petty insults. Instead, I calmly dismantled every false accusation she threw at me, speaking in measured, resonant tones, designed to carry effortlessly across the speakerphone. By leaving the line open and unmuted, I unwittingly transformed our private conversation into an open public forum, broadcast directly into Margaret's living room. Every sharp word I uttered drifted cleanly into the crowded house, shattering the illusion of their manufactured prosperity and exposing the dark, ugly reality of their entitlement to every single guest standing in the tense room. Sensing the immediate collapse of her social standing as the surrounding relatives froze in stunned silence, Mason frantically lunged forward and snatched the phone away from his sobbing wife's trembling hands. Pressing the receiver tightly against his ear, his voice cracked open with raw, pathetic desperation as he began to cry, begging me to come home and save their crumbling reputation. He stammered frantically about how family was always supposed to stick together through thick and thin, weaponizing the sacred concept of unconditional kinship, just as he had been trained to do. But his desperate pleading fell upon ears that had finally learned the heavy, exhausting cost of blind coddling. With quiet, unshakable firmness, I reminded my 33-year-old son that true family loyalty is built on mutual respect, honesty, and accountability, not on exploitation and the silent theft of a father's retirement. I told him plainly that he was a grown man who had chosen to sleep in a bed of his own making, and it was past time for him to stop whining and finally face the consequences of his actions. The harsh, unvarnished truth spilled out through the phone speaker with such devastating clarity that it instantly cut through the stunned silence of the living room, reaching the ears of every confused relative. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire as uncles, aunts, and cousins slowly pieced together the shocking reality that there was no corporate bonus, no luxury lifestyle, and no generous host funding the grand estate. Standing near the center of the room, Brianna's father, Richard, turned completely pale, his imposing businessman posture collapsing under the crushing weight of public embarrassment and profound shock. The absolute gravity of the revelation struck him like a physical blow as he realized the bitter, humiliating truth. His daughter and son-in-law were not successful homeowners hosting a grand holiday feast, but rather destitute freeloaders who had illegally squatted in an aging teacher's house for 2 long years while stealing his retirement funds. The illusion of grandeur shattered entirely, leaving Richard staring at the floor in utter disbelief as the shameful scaffolding of his family's pride crumbled into absolute dust. The momentous confrontation finally drew to its inevitable, agonizing close when I calmly tapped the end call button on my phone, severing the digital tether and plunging the mountain porch back into absolute restorative silence. Back in Los Angeles, the disconnection marked the final, catastrophic collapse of Brianna's elaborate digital empire, leaving her standing amidst the wreckage of her own unsustainable lies, with nowhere left to hide. The house erupted into chaotic uproar as furious relatives grabbed their coats, denounced the deceit, and stormed out the front door, abandoning the fraudulent couple to their well-deserved misery. Brianna collapsed onto the hallway floor, weeping with the raw, inconsolable despair of a person whose entire superficial identity had been incinerated in a single afternoon. Mason stood silently by the wall, watching his wife's meltdown with hollow eyes, realizing that their selfish choices had finally cost them everything they ever faked. The storm had cleared away the toxic debris, leaving behind the stark, sobering ruins for the dishonest architects to clean up entirely on their own terms. The calendar marched steadily forward until the morning of November 30th, when I finally steered my car back onto my familiar suburban street in Los Angeles after a restorative retreat. Even before my tires rolled to a complete stop against the curb, I noticed a stark, white rental moving truck parked awkwardly right in front of my driveway, its wide rolling door opened wide to the morning light. Stepping out of the vehicle, I saw my 33-year-old son, Mason, laboring down the walkway, struggling to carry a heavy cardboard packing box cradled securely in his trembling arms. His face looked hollowed out, ashen, and profoundly aged by the brutal, unyielding shock of sudden reality, bearing the exhausted physical signature of a man who had not slept a wink in 3 full days. The arrogant posture and misplaced pride that had characterized his arrival months prior were completely gone, replaced entirely by the crushing weight of utter humiliation and defeat. He carried himself with the heavy, broken gait of someone who had finally crashed against the hard edges of life, standing silently on the pavement as a living testament to the devastating cost of blind complicity. Stopping at the end of the driveway, with his heavy box still clutched tightly against his chest, Mason looked at me with red-rimmed, swimming eyes that carried the raw vulnerability of a child begging for grace. His voice fractured completely as he confessed in a choked whisper that he had sold the luxury SUV in a hasty private transaction just 3 days prior to salvage whatever dignity remained. With those meager funds, he had managed to repay a small portion of the stolen retirement money and secure a modest deposit on a cramped, third-floor apartment located in a noisy district of Burbank. He swallowed hard, his chin trembling uncontrollably as he admitted that the apartment was tiny, that its elevator was permanently broken, and that Brianna had spent days weeping uncontrollably over the sudden descent into ordinary life. He stared down at the concrete pavement, his voice cracking with deep, agonizing sorrow as he acknowledged that he did not deserve another chance, bravely refusing to ask for a cheap, unearned forgiveness. He only needed me to know that he finally understood the full, destructive magnitude of his grave mistakes, offering a broken heart and a profoundly remorseful spirit. A heavy, piercing wave of paternal empathy surged through my chest, dissolving whatever lingering bitterness remained as I looked upon my fallen son, standing amidst the cardboard boxes of his own undoing. I stepped forward deliberately, closed the small physical distance between us, and placed a warm, steady hand firmly upon his trembling shoulder, just as I had done when he was a frightened boy. I told him softly that I understood, offering the deep, unconditional forgiveness that only a grieving father could give, yet making it explicitly clear that compassion could no longer mean rescue. I looked straight into his tear-filled eyes and explained with gentle, unyielding firmness that stepping back and allowing him to face the full consequences of his actions was the only genuine way to save his character. True parental love, I reminded him, is never about shielding children from the storms they create, but rather about possessing the profound courage to let them walk through the fire so they can finally learn to stand entirely on their own 2 feet. He closed his eyes for a long moment, absorbing the weight of my words with a quiet, settling peace that signaled the long overdue beginning of his true, painful, and permanent emotional maturity. Within the hour, the white rental truck rumbled down the street and disappeared around the corner, carrying away the last lingering shadows of domestic turbulence, broken trust, and manufactured illusion from Margaret's home. I walked slowly up the front steps and stepped across the threshold into a house that suddenly felt wonderfully quiet, deeply breathable, and entirely restored to its original, sacred dignity. There were still minor scuff marks on the hallway baseboards and subtle reminders of chaos, but the suffocating emotional weight of exploitation had been completely lifted from every room. I moved from room to room, opening every single window wide, welcoming the crisp, refreshing December breeze to sweep through and cleanse the air of past grievances. Walking into the sunlit kitchen, I opened the oven door and began roasting a modest turkey breast, seasoned carefully with garlic and rosemary, filling the entire house with the nostalgic, comforting aroma that Margaret had always loved. Sitting alone at the clean dining table, with a single place setting and a glass of cool water, I finally experienced the profound, unhurried luxury of eating a meal in absolute, uninterrupted peace within my own sanctuary. Late that golden afternoon, I carried a warm cup of decaffeinated coffee out onto the weathered wooden porch and settled comfortably into Margaret's favorite chair to watch the shadows lengthen across the garden. My gaze drifted naturally toward the front fence, where her beloved rose bushes stood dormant and bare in the winter chill, yet their root systems remained strong and healthy, quietly preparing to push forth new life come spring. A serene, unburdened smile spread across my face as I looked down at my hands, realizing with absolute clarity the most vital lesson of my entire life's journey. I finally understood, deep within my soul, that kindness without boundaries is never true kindness, but merely an open invitation to self-destruction. True family justice begins the exact moment you decide your personal dignity is non-negotiable. I had stopped funding my own disrespect, and in doing so, I had reclaimed not just my house, but my peace, my sovereign self-worth, and my unshakable freedom. The bitter winter winds of betrayal had finally cleared away, leaving behind a brilliant, unblemished horizon where a wise man could rest easy, knowing that grace always follows truth, and peace always belongs to those who dare to draw a firm, unbreakable line.